Hi, everyone. Good to be here today. And I will be talking to you about human-centered design and mHealth systems. So I'm excited to spend an hour with you talking about this topic. So just an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk about just an introduction, also some assumptions that I have about you as my audience. I'm going to talk to you about the human-centered design process and kind of get into the nuts and bolts about what goes into doing human-centered design work. And then I'm going to go through a case study that I've done in my own research on a project called Baby Steps that will take you through each of those steps. So just a little bit about me. I'm a professor and department chair of human-centered design and engineering at the University of Washington. My background is in computer science from Georgia Tech, and I have spent the last 15 years as a professor doing all sorts of research in the area of designing and evaluating novel health technology interventions in the space of health, education, and families. Also doing a lot of work with children and thinking through how we can support their health and education. I do a lot of teaching in the areas of user-centered design, user experience design, inclusive design. I've also taught some classes on doing interaction design in children. And just on a personal note, I have two kiddos myself. They get to participate in my research sometimes. Maya 10 and Rohan 7, and I'm a huge advocate for helping others make it work to have families and researchers at the same time. So if anybody has questions about that, I'm happy to always talk about that. Okay, so let me make some assumptions about you. I know we're not here together at the time you're watching a recording, but what I know about you in the MHTI program is that you're from a wide range of backgrounds, and some of you may or may not have a basic understanding of the human-centered design process. So if you do have that background, some of this may be review for you, but I recognize some of you coming into this may have no background whatsoever. So I'm going to assume that some of you know this, some of you don't, and that some of this will be review. I also assume that you have an interest in designing a new mHealth system. So thinking through what it's like to design a new technology intervention or monitoring tool or diagnostic tool in the mobile health space, and that you have interest in designing that. And then my third assumption is that you actually care about the people that you're designing for, and you want them to have a good experience and have good outcomes as part of this work. And so I truly believe that human-centered design can help you get there. So those are my assumptions about you going into this. Okay, so what are the learning objectives for this lecture today? So first, I want you to understand that the human-centered design is a process and that it is something that you can learn how to do. I want you to understand different evaluation techniques that can go into assessing the quality of tech-based health interventions and application designs. And then I want you to understand how the human-centered design process can be part of an interdisciplinary health team. So many of you are going to be working on teams with other people from different disciplines as part of this program. And I want you to understand how human-centered design can fit into that. Okay, now let's get into the process. So I'm going to talk a bit about the process and then go into some different methods that go into that. Okay, so first, what do I even mean by design? A lot of people throw that around. Maybe you have perceptions of design being related to fashion or art, and those are all true, but I want to break down the definition of design as we mean it in the human-centered design component. So what we believe is that design is a process for creating or shaping tools or artifacts for direct human use. And so I'm going to break that down a little bit. And so again, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's a process. So design is not just an outcome, but it's a process. But there is some intention of creating something. So it is a creative endeavor. You're creating something that does not yet exist. Also, what you're designing is a new thing or something that existed that didn't exist before. So it's an artifact that you're developing as part of this process. And that the goal of doing so is something for direct human use. And so you might be able to do process for creating and shaping tools or artifacts that maybe don't have a practical use. Maybe that's considered art and it's not sort of intended to be used, it's intended to be looked at and reacted to. But when we talk about design in the sense, we're thinking about things that people will be using in their day-to-day lives for some particular need. So here's an overview of the human-centered design process. And if this is review for you, you may have seen many, many different versions of this. I've actually seen a document that has like over 100 different versions of what a design process could look like from a human-centered design perspective. So there's not one way of encapsulating this process because it is a little bit messy. This is one of my favorite representations of this that I use in teaching my classes because I think it breaks it down in a way that's quite easy to follow, and it's easy to break down and understand. So this is the process that I use in teaching. It is not the one and the only true process that you have to use in your work, but I'm going to use this as a way of teaching you all about human-centered design. So one thing to note about the process is it's a cycle, right? And so there's different stages of that, but the big thing is that it's a circle. And so one of the main things to know about the human-centered design process is that it is iterative. And so you may hit each of these stages numerous times as you're going about your work and improving your work over time. Because the first time you design something, you're not going to get it right the first time. And so it takes going through this process numerous times to get through and make sure you're getting it right. And we're going to break down this process into multiple components as well. Okay, so at each stage, there's a number of different goals. And so I'm going to kind of share with you what those goals might look like. So first of all, in the user research stage, this is really where you're going about needs assessment. So who are your stakeholders and what do they need? How are things being done now? What are the concerns about the way it's being done now? What's being done now that isn't quite meeting their needs, and what is wanted that will better meet their needs? Also, what else has been tried? Have people tried doing different things that didn't work? If it didn't work, why? Those are the types of, you do ask a lot of questions in these stages. The next stage is taking those needs and turning them into new ideas. And so this is called the ideation stage. And so the whole point of this is to come up with many, many different ideas. And then also sort of thinking around this match between what the needs are and what the potential solution space could be. It's a really fun stage. We'll go into a little bit later, but it's one of my favorite stages. The next thing is that once you have all these ideas, you really need something that people can experience and interact with to give you feedback on. And so that's called a prototype. And so a prototype is something tangible. In the process of going from an idea to a prototype, you're also sort of thinking about how do these challenges work in the real world and some of these subtleties that come up in the process, and how does that get implemented into design. Once you have a prototype, then you can evaluate it. And this can be all sorts of things. It could be, putting a prototype in front of people and just asking them questions, all the way down to doing an experimental design where you're sort of having some quantitative outcomes. But this whole goal is to discover problems, assess progress, and then determine next steps. And so you might notice in this cycle that there's 3 arrows coming out of the evaluation stage going back to those. And that's really depending on whatever you learn from this evaluation stage, you end up deciding whether or not you will need to go back to the research, ideation, or prototyping stage. So if the evaluation stage tells you that, you know what, like we're not really solving their problem. Maybe you didn't quite understand the problem well and you need to do some more user research. Or maybe the problem was right, but the prototype was not quite right. Maybe you developed a smartwatch solution, but what people really needed was something that worked well on the tablet that they carry around with them in the hospital. And so then you might have to go back to the ideation stage. Or maybe you hit it right, they really needed a smartphone design or a smartwatch design, but there's some usability issues. And so you kind of go back within your prototype. And so depending what you learn from that, you might go back to one of these different stages. There's also a 5th stage in this process that in research often takes a long time to get to. So that's called the production stage. And so if you're doing this in industry, this would include like building the final product, thinking about marketing and customer support and maintenance. In the mHealth space, I often think about this as being sort of the clinical trial stage. And so, you really want to go through this process multiple times before you actually go to something like a clinical trial. You don't want to definitely start there. So I kind of I think that that's something that would be coming later on in your research. But in the early stages, you're going to mostly focus on these other 4. Okay, so let's break down what kinds of methods look like within each of these stages. So starting with user research, this is really kind of the social science piece of human-centered design. So many of you, if you have social science backgrounds or work with social scientists, might be familiar with all of these methods. It can do things like surveys or focus groups, interviews, might be analyzing sort of the competition. So what are the other sort of interventions out there in the space and what are their pros and cons? It might be a great technique called contextual inquiry, where you're observing people in their context and sort of following them along and taking notes and asking them questions as they're going about their day. Really great for understanding things like workflows. Or it could even be more in depth, like a design ethnography, where you're spending weeks or months hanging out with the people that you're designing for and learning in depth really about who they are and what they need. So one of the things to think through about user research results is that the goal is that you want to have a deep understanding of who your users are, and you really want it to come out of this a set of requirements, considerations, and challenges. So this is really going to inform the types of things that you might do with this type of information, and what would lead you to wanting to design a specific intervention. So, in the field where I come from, human-computer interaction, this type of research can be its own user research result and publication if it's deep and generalizable enough to kind of have this broader implications. And so one great example from the mHealth field was a study that some of my colleagues did on examining all of the issues and challenges around things like food journaling. So they did surveys and interviews and with people who were doing food journaling to try to understand what the challenges are with that, what they liked about it, and what kind of about the existing tools today were not quite meeting the needs of people. And that in and of itself is a whole contribution. So that can be a contribution in and of itself, depending on the scope of it. So after the stage, you may have a set of requirements. So they might be things like, it needs to function in a high stress hospital situation, or it needs to be hands-free because you're working with surgeons and they don't have the ability to interact with a touchscreen device while they're scrubbed up. Or it might be, has to be privacy preserving because of HIPAA requirements. And so you might have developed all these requirements through this process. And taking those requirements to design is a bit of a challenge and a stretch. And it is also a bit of a subjective process. Sometimes we hope from this process that we end up having this exact beautiful solution that we know is there. But there is some creativity. Remember, I said it's a creative process that goes into deciding what you're going to build and what you're going to design. So the good news, though, is that although it's tricky, it's something that we have a process for and tools to do that. So we can do things like developing some use cases or personas or scenarios, and then also going through this the next two stages of this process, which is the brainstorming or ideation and prototyping. So I'm going to talk about those next. Okay, so you now have a set of requirements and challenges and things that you're trying to address with design. So then you want to go to the brainstorming stage. So maybe some of you've done this before, but ideation in the design space is something that's really fun. And a mantra to sort of keep in mind here is that anything goes in the stage because you're trying to generate as many ideas as possible. And so, we often say the best way to have a good idea is to have lots of ideas and then throw away the bad ones. That's kind of a well-trodden mantra throughout the human-centered design world. And this is what you're trying to do here, trying to come up with as many ideas as possible. So this might be developing, doing lots of sketching, or doing things like even like role playing or acting things out. So especially maybe you're trying to design something like a robotic system to fit into a nursing space. And so you might want to act out, okay, what would happen if there's walking through here and walking through there? So kind of a creative process, and you're going to get your creative juices on a little bit to do that work. So here's an example of some of the sketches I've done for a project relating to designing for sleep. And so what we did was we set a whole team of people who had read all the user research and knew all about our designing constraints, and we just sketched for a couple hours. We definitely had food and made it fun. We filled an entire conference room with as many sketches as possible. And so then we encouraged wild ideas. And then we ended up voting on the best ones. And so throughout the ideation process, you do the switch between what's called divergent and convergent thinking. And so when you start brainstorming, you start developing as many ideas as possible. And then at some point when you run out of ideas, sometimes we shoot for just 100 ideas because you want to stretch our brains as much as possible. And some of these ideas are going to be terrible ideas, but they're just ideas that you're getting out there. But then you're going to make a switch. Either you run out of ideas or you run out of time, and then you're going to make the switch and start to do convergent thinking, which then is starting to narrow down those choices. So that's what we often do by voting. Sometimes we'll take little sticky dots, and we'll give everybody on the team 5 sticky dots, and they have to put their dots on the ideas that they find most interesting or most feasible or most meeting the user's needs. So when you are doing this sort of narrowing down process, you want to think about, okay, what are my user needs? So going back to your user research, what are the known constraints? So are there cost constraints or feasibility constraints or any regulations, like I mentioned HIPAA, for example, that are going into this that you need to be aware of when sort of eliminating the possibility of those choices. So maybe you have like this really cool idea for this augmented reality system that's going to live in the children's hospital ward, but you're realizing that the Wi-Fi and the space you're going to be developing is not good enough to support that. So it's really important to kind of know those constraints while you're sort of trying to eliminate those ideas and kind of narrow them down. So other things might be effectiveness, efficiency, and utility, which we'll talk a little bit more in the evaluation stage. Okay, so now you have an idea. Maybe you have some promising ideas that came up from there. Maybe you have like 3 or 4 different ideas that are directions from the ideation stage. Now you have to take those ideas and turn them into prototypes. So the good news is that anybody can make a prototype. I think people sometimes get nervous that like, oh, I don't have the skills to develop that, but you can make a prototype out of sticky notes and paper and markers. And hopefully you learn those skills when you were in elementary school to sort of cut out paper and draw. It doesn't have to be pretty. And in fact, sometimes the sketchier your ideas, the more willing people are to give you feedback on those ideas, because they realize it's like, oh, you didn't spend a ton of time on this, so clearly this is an early idea and I can still give you some feedback. But it might also, maybe you're developing like a new kiosk, so maybe you'll develop cardboard or foam core. Maybe you might develop a video prototype where you have people sort of act out or demonstrate things. You might be developing a hyperlink prototype, so you can develop a prototype that sort of clicks through these things and shows you screen to screen as you click through it. And you can do that with something like PowerPoint. So if you can make a slideshow, you can make a hyperlink hyperlink prototype with PowerPoint, which is pretty cool. This might also range down to like building a fully functional prototype where it's kind of coded and you can actually like put it on people's phones and they can interact with it. That's usually going to come a little bit later. So you want to start with prototyping, doing the earlier stage, throw away on paper, and then you'll learn from those. And then you'll eventually end up with a more functional prototype, which you can then deploy. So as I mentioned, anyone can create a prototype. So here's some pictures of examples of what we call low fidelity prototypes. And so you could see it could just be markers and paper. You can use sticky notes to simulate the buttons. And so there's a number of kind of templates out there that you can use if you don't want to sort of draw everything on an app. So you can kind of see some examples here. Sometimes you'll have some of the details, like you might have the menu here, or you draw some little icons, but sometimes you don't have all the details, right? Because it's at this stage, you're mostly getting feedback on the layout. So you don't necessarily need to have all the content in this place because you're mostly focusing on that. So these are some examples of paper prototypes, which I believe any of you should be able to do. There's also some really great tools out there for making clickable prototypes or hyperlink prototypes. So this is a easy mobile prototyping tool called Marvel that you can go to marvelapp.com, and you can take those actual sketches, take photos of them with your phone, and then you can import them into Marvel and actually make them little clickable. So you can say like, okay, when they click on this area of this sketch, it takes them to this page, and then it actually will show up on people's phones. So you can make a paper prototype show up on people's phones in a way that doesn't require any coding at all. So this is something I do with, I've done this with middle school students. I've done this with students taking introductory human-centered design classes. And so you can totally all do this with your prototypes and no coding required. You can get a prototype up and going in less than an hour. Okay, so you have a prototype now. What do you need to do next? So there's a whole bunch of methods on there, because I alluded to before, this can be anywhere from showing someone your prototype and interviewing them and asking them for feedback to kind of a more structured or controlled experiment. Usability testing is often one of the core aspects of this evaluation, where you're sort of bringing someone in, sitting them down and having them try out different tasks. So you might have them, okay, go through the prototype and try to book an appointment with the tool. And so they have to go through and they like start on the start screen and they going through and like, okay, I have to click here and there, and you're kind of observing them and asking them questions about, where do they get confused and where do they seem to understand it. You might follow up a usability test with a survey. So the system usability scale, the SUS, is a really popular one. That's like a 10-item validated questionnaire that kind of gets at the usability. There's also things like the user burden scale that kind of thinks about, like, if you've given someone a prototype and you think about some of these burdens that might place on like privacy or emotional burdens or cognitive burdens. So there's different types of scales you can use. You can also do things like expert review. So something like a heuristic evaluation is where you bring design experts to actually look at your prototype and tell you sort of the common usability problems that they see. So maybe you forgot a way to exit out of a particular screen you're on, and you can find that out by having an expert go through your prototype and find that out before you sort of go through the hassle of bringing your participants into a lab setting. So lots of different ways you can evaluate here, and I won't go through all of them, but just know there's a number of different ways you can evaluate your prototypes. So as I mentioned, those 3 arrows again, so what you find in your evaluation really will drive the next round of iteration. So again, if it's like something that there's like a performance issue, maybe they made a number of errors or they couldn't quite navigate the interface very well. Then you can kind of go back to the prototyping stage and, okay, you know what, we forgot to add these menus here, or we really need a better navigation screen to get us through here. So kind of go back to that prototyping stage. If the problems are more conceptual and how they understand it, then you may have to go back to the ideation stage. Maybe your concept isn't quite right. Maybe the augmented reality wasn't quite understanding of there. Maybe you need to think through some other type of approach to that. And then again, if the problems are in usefulness or appropriateness, then you probably made them, you had some issues in your user research stage where you didn't quite uncover the right constraints or the right problems. And so again, sort of thinking through where you go next after the evaluation stage. So in mHealth apps, I definitely want to discourage you from thinking about a randomized controlled trial as your first step. So you're going to get things wrong and you don't want to go through the hassle of bringing in people, randomizing them to different conditions, and then giving them a prototype that has some just minor fundamental usability concerns that you didn't find out. So there's a really great paper from Pejay Klazania, Sunny Consalvo, and Wanda Pratt that's actually over a decade old now, specifically around how to evaluate technologies for health. That talks a little bit around, really starting with things like more qualitative assessments in the beginning. Interviews and surveys are really great. And you want to, because you really want to know why things are working in the beginning. And then once you have a really good sense that this is the right approach, then you can sort of think through about designing some sort of efficacy trial beyond just doing kind of those surveys and interviews in the beginning. It's also one kind of thing to know about is it's really impossible to assess a technology intervention for efficacy by not thinking about how it's designed. And so I've met a number of health researchers who sort of, when they think about designing a clinical trial, they'll have their conditions be app versus no app or the standard of care. But they don't really give any input in how the app is designed. And so I have a screenshot here from a great study that was done, was a big, large scale clinical trial that was done on weight loss apps. And they specifically had, the weight loss app that they were using on a mobile phone and, no weight loss app in their comparison. And so they kind of didn't end up finding a difference between the two conditions. And so the conclusion was that weight loss apps might not help in losing weight. So their primary outcome didn't end up finding a result. But they didn't necessarily take into account how it was designed, right? And so the choices that you make within these tools and how you design them can make a big difference. Maybe it wasn't quite usable, or maybe it kept crashing on their phones, or maybe there were issues with not having the right information in there. And so you can't just treat a technology as sort of a single type of intervention without really thinking about those details and how it was designed. Maybe with more usability, focus on usability, or maybe there were too many features and people got confused and overwhelmed. So there's a lot of these things that can go into how it was designed that can have an impact, not just the app alone, or with an app or without an app. So I got a little frustrated that the press sort of picked up on this finding from this big study that nutrition or weight loss apps don't work at all, because as we know, how they're designed really can make a difference. So it could be just this particular app didn't work, but another design with different features and different sort of approaches could work. So other sort of things to note. So little design choices can make a big difference. So kind of just expanding on the last point. So we actually did a small study in my group a number of years ago, sort of just thinking about things like positive versus negative framing and how you give feedback to people. So we were interested in kind of fitness trackers and how it was representing your progress towards a goal. And so we did just a small study, a quantitative study online, where we showed people different representations of how you might convey how close you were to a goal. So the one on the left was positively framed, that you've achieved 2,500 steps versus that you have 7,500 steps remaining. So this is the same information, but it's one's framed towards what you've accomplished and one's framed in terms of what you have left to go. And we actually had them talk about what would your self-efficacy be if you saw this, and in terms of being able to complete your goal for the day. And we found significant differences in when we had a positive framing versus a negative framing. And so that was just a little design choice. And as a designer, you might make thousands of these choices when designing an overall prototype that you need to know. And so that's why I want to caution you around sort of thinking through that, no matter what you design, it's going to have the same outcome, because how you design it really does matter. So paying attention to that is important. So if we shouldn't start with randomized control trials and efficacy trials as a first go, there's a number of things that you can do that might lead you to having better outcomes in the long run. So for example, how engaging is it? How many times do they open it per day? What features are they using within it? How usable is it? So I mentioned the system usability scale could be one way to look at. Why are they using or not using certain features? So I want to caution anybody against using an entirely quantitative metric, because the one thing that's the most frustrating to me is if we get a quantitative result and can't explain why we have that result. And so I'm a big mixed methods person. So I always agree that you should be pairing any sort of quantitative measure with some sort of qualitative measure, even if it's just an open-ended survey question at the end of your study saying, what did you like about the app and what could be improved? Because you can find a lot about that information about why you're seeing certain results that you're seeing. Other things you might think about nearer term outcomes than sort of a health outcome. So something like self-efficacy, or as I mentioned, sort of things like user burden as well too. So you're trying to prevent sort of the negative things that might be happening from using an app. There's another great tool or methodology within the mHealth space. And so this is also by Pedja Klasenia, who did the previous article on how to evaluate technologies. And so sort of thinking through this in-between stage. So recognizing that clinical trials are a very challenging thing and a very expensive thing to pull off, and it may not be the right thing for a mHealth application, especially in the beginning. So maybe you do have this question around like, does my visualization tool need to be positively or negatively framed? Or do we need to do a visualization, or is just kind of texting them the information okay? So you might have these kind of questions that you have. And so they've been developing sort of this new methodology, sort of step between sort of starting with a qualitative study and going all the way to clinical trial. That's sort of these what they are calling sort of usable evidence. And so these might be things like factorial designs, or trying to identify what are these different questions that we have, and can we do these small little experiments where maybe you give half the participants a version that doesn't have the visualization and half that does, and you're sort of thinking through testing at a feature level some of these outcomes. And so again, you're sort of, the process is brainstorming different ideas, identifying a causal pathway and these proximal outcomes. So instead of something like tracking weight loss, which is a far off tool, maybe you're looking at something like steps per day, or daily sleepiness scores on a sleepiness scale. So what is something you can measure very frequently and test on a short-term scale? Then you might have your multiple prototypes, and then you do these shorter-term studies to sort of identify, are you addressing a proximal outcome as opposed to your far out outcome? So really love this method. Happy to talk to anybody more about this method and sort of how this can be something you build into your ideas. Okay, so kind of went through the rest of the stage. And now that I talked about the sort of last stage of production. So again, this is sort of all these steps that might be required to take a later stage prototype called a functional prototype and then sort of release it. So I would say this is the stage you want to get to before you do a clinical trial. So this might include programming it. Is there training that needs to be done? Is there maybe in the research space we think a little bit less about marketing or branding or business cases, but we might have a customer support needs, right? So if anybody has any problems with the tool, especially if you're doing a longer term study, who do they contact and how do they get to how do they get help, and can we give them help, right? So kind of answering some of those questions about your tool after you sort of built the prototype. So I kind of presented my process. I just wanted, as I mentioned, there's like hundreds of different ways of conveying this. Here's another example from researcher Bill Mogridge. So he kind of has similar stages, but also iterative, but has many more stages than the ones I talked about. And he sort of talks about like, I like the web in the middle is sort of one person's example of how they jump from stage to stage. And so it might not be a neat process as you're going from each of these different stages. So that's one example. If you need to cite this in a grant, there's also an ISO standard for the user-centered design process. Maybe you want to use this one. I like how this one actually captures planning the human-centered design process as part of the process itself. But you're understanding and specifying context of use and the user requirements, talking about different design solutions, evaluating them. So you see some familiar things to the model that I showed. And then, of course, that iteration stage and going through there. Stanford D School has their own process. They use a phrase called empathizing and defining instead of user research. They use testing to evaluate. So again, very similar, but sometimes different names for different stages. This is IDEO's human-centered design process as well too, that also thinks about kind of things over time, and they talk about hearing, creating, and then delivering. So again, sort of similar, but different. So before you, I do believe that you can all do design, but I also just want to give you some sense of why design is hard. And so one of the things is that to do really good experience design, it really does require a multidisciplinary team. And so it's really hard for one person from one field to really design a really great mHealth tool. And so you really have to be able to have good teamwork skills and engage with each other, and learn from each other's disciplines to be able to develop really good and novel solutions. Also, designing and predicting which designs will be successful and which will not is quite difficult. So you might notice that a number of really bad designs end up being products and being sold and being flops in the market. And it's not that they intended for these to be bad designs, but sometimes it is just really hard to judge until you get it out there and in people's hands. And so by doing a good job with the user-centered design process, hopefully we can predict and kind of eliminate some of those things in the beginning, but sometimes you can't always predict the future. So even if you've done a really good job, you may not always find like the exact thing that people really needed. So it's not a perfect process. It will do a better job of just coming up with something, building it, and throwing it out there if you go through this process. But in and of itself, this process does not guarantee success. And then it's also just hard to come up with good solutions. And so the reason for this is the space of what is possible is very big compared to the space of what is good. And so you can imagine at an ideation process, if we're coming up with 100 different ideas, maybe all 100 of them are possible, but maybe only like 2 or 3 of them are good. And so it's a lot easier to come up with bad ideas than it is to kind of narrow down those good ideas. But that's why it's important to come up with a lot of different ideas, because then you really know that the ideas that you came up with are good, because you can compare them to all these 99 bad ideas that you threw out. Okay, so I think people may be also interested in something called co-design. And so this is something I've also been very interested in. And so if you've heard that term before, co-design is thinking about who your users are going to be, and actually engaging them throughout this whole process. So bring them in at the user research stage, the ideation stage, the prototyping stage, and the evaluation stage, and have them actually become design partners with what you're doing. So I have some examples here from a method that Jason Yip and Allison Druin, who is a researcher in the child-computer interaction space, have been working on for many years, called Kids Team. And so they really sort of build up this team of kids as researchers who help research teams and partner with them to come up with different and new design ideas. And so it's an after-school program, or sometimes you do it in libraries on weekends. But they have these kids and they meet over and over again. So they build up this relationship over time. The kids learn how to design and prototype alongside the adults on the team. And so you can do this with your team. So maybe you have patients that you're designing for, and inviting a patient as part of your design team would be a wonderful way to do co-design with your partners, because that can really, having someone on your team who knows the field and knows the experience of what it's like, can be an excellent way to end up with a great design. So back on kind of design being hard, all design involves maximizing trade-offs. So you may have constraints on there, and you may try to meet all those constraints, but sometimes it's just not possible. And so back in my engineering days, we had sort of a discussion of like, good, fast, and cheap, and you get to pick 2, right? So if it's good and fast, it's not going to be cheap. If it's cheap and fast, it's not going to be good. And if it's cheap and good, it will be very slow. So kind of thinking through what are those trade-offs, and which ones are you going to maximize, because you might end up having different constraints. Also, you have different user needs that might be in contrast with each other. So maybe you have some people who really want really detailed information about everything about their lives, and they just want to do this kind of quantified self approach. And then you may have another set of users who are very privacy conscious and don't want anything captured. So how do you sort of find a happy medium in those spaces is there too. As I mentioned, kind of good designs are not always the obvious ones. Humans are unpredictable, they make errors. And design relies on the process expertise and not knowledge expertise. And so you can bring someone to your team that has knowledge of the design process, but they don't always have the knowledge of the expertise. So bringing in people who have both of those things into your team can be really helpful. But it is hard, but it's also important. So there's a lot of research that shows that people will abandon technologies if they find them overly burdened, no matter how effective the intervention is. So we know so many interventions that work that people just don't use because they're really burdensome. They're a lot of work, or they make them feel bad about themselves, or they're really challenging or time consuming to use. And so efficacy shouldn't be our number one goal. That user experience and that understanding those burdens and minimizing those burdens, this should be a big part of our process. If you've ever gone to the App Store, it's basically a graveyard of all these health apps that have been built on good ideas or like kind of solid research backing, but they don't have a really good implementation. So they're buggy, they crash all the time. They're full of just content after pages and pages of content without really any expectation around the how it's going to play together. It's very boring. It's not very engaging. So there's a lot of things that people build that don't end up getting used because of poor design. And then also there's some research that shows that people will actually spend longer using things they find enjoyable and aesthetically pleasing, even if they don't necessarily like the underlying content. So it is important to sort of think through these things. So kind of the core skills of design include synthesizing a solution from all of the different constraints and understanding everything that will make a difference in the end result, reframing or framing the problem and objective in different ways, creating and envisioning different alternatives to design, selecting from those alternatives and knowing how to choose the best approach, and then visualizing a prototype of the intended solution. Here's another set of ideas and design that are visual. So it might include, this is done by Professor Amy Coe at the University of Washington. So she developed, these cute little sketches around like brainstorming lots of ideas, scoping, so converging, diverging into a solution, thinking about a span of ideas and identifying the good ones, having an idea in your head and communicating that idea to your team, sharing ownership of ideas with the team, critiquing ideas once they've been put into place, and then providing a rationale for why you chose those ideas. So like this is a visual way of thinking about those concepts. The other thing I'll close with before I kind of wrap up the process is the best way to offend a designer is to tell them that they're just make things look good. And I've actually been in an actual real life talk with someone who said, oh, we brought a designer in a team to make it look good. And I was like, oh, no, that's clearly a fundamental understanding of what design is. So it's not just about making things look good or pretty or doing the graphic design. It really is fundamentally thinking about what is this concept? How is it being delivered? What is the navigation through the system going to be? It's great if it also looks good, because as we know, people like if they're using things that are aesthetically pleasing, and people will judge your app if it looks good or not. But you can have a perfectly great app that is kind of minimalist and doesn't have to be really fancy or over the top. As long as it's clean and usable, that can be a great solution. But definitely not there to just put lipstick on a pig, because if your underlying ideas and your underlying implementation is bad, even if it looks pretty, it's not going to be a great solution. Awesome. All right, so that's it from the process stage. And now I'm going to talk about how this works in practice. So I am going to be talking about a case study that I've done in health research on a project called Baby Steps. So I'm going to talk about how I went through each stage of that process. Okay, so Baby Steps is a long-term study. I actually started this in my dissertation work. So it's a very long-term process. I've gone through multiple iterations of this design stage over time. So I'm going to kind of give you the shorter version of that, but happy to talk in detail about some of these things in the longer term. But our overall goal was thinking about trying to help parents of kids under the age of 5 track developmental progress and screen for developmental delay from a universal approach. So how do we sort of get every child in a population screened and connected to early intervention services if needed? And so our approach was to think about using multiple technology platforms. So we learned right away, if we're going to do this universal approach, we can't have one tool that meets the needs of every single person in a community. So we thought about things like web-based approaches, text messaging approaches, social media-based approaches to kind of reach different populations with the overall goal of doing developmental screening. And we had some key insights about our users, in particular, that tracking developmental milestones can be very anxiety inducing for parents. So thinking about red flags or what's wrong, or comparing their kiddos to other kids and thinking it through, oh my gosh, my kid's not walking yet, if there's something wrong with them, is a pretty anxiety inducing process. But kids do love, or parents do love celebrating their kids' growth. We saw, in our user research, we're seeing lots of growth charts and baby books and sort of this, photos and videos of people documenting their kids' growth and celebrating their kids' growth. And so those were some of our key insights that we were thinking through. So we ended up developing a number of different prototypes. So we had a web portal, we could log on and complete screener tools, and then also sort of track those in a more celebratory way. So they could design a little timeline that kind of showed their kids' progress over time. They could also add in not just developmental milestones, but also fun little sentimental milestones like first trip to the zoo or first trip to grandma's house, and the things you might see in baby books. This is something they could kind of share with their friends and family as well too. Then we had the online screener tools. And so screening is usually consistent of a bunch of kind of questions around, can your kids do various things? So there's like different categories. So communication, social, emotional, problem solving, fine motor, and gross motor. And so kind of answering 6 yes or no questions and on a different stage. You can see on the left, there's a bunch of different ages that you can complete questionnaires from. So you want to kind of answer the right questionnaire when the child's at that age. So you can answer to each of those questions, you can answer yes, not yet, or sometimes. And so then you can receive a score based on how many questions that you say yes to or sometimes to. So there's 3 kind of outcomes from the screener. So they can be on track, everything looks good. You can be sort of in this let's watch category, meaning they're sort of like close to being delayed, but not quite there, or a more evaluation needed. So this is a screener, not diagnostic. And so more evaluation needed just means that we would recommend that you talk to somebody to do a more in-depth evaluation. And sometimes people are seen as being a little bit behind just because they haven't been exposed to something, right? So you can imagine one of the questions is like, can they put beads onto a string? Well, if you've never given your child to do that, then you wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. It doesn't mean that they're delayed, it just means they haven't been given the opportunity. So if they're in the let's watch category, sometimes recommendation is just give them ideas for activities they can do to encourage development in that area. We came up with different visualizations. So again, using the sort of metaphor of, a child who is not meeting different milestones may not be delayed, they just haven't yet reach their growth potential. So we use this tree metaphor to kind of visualize where they were in different categories. So thinking about kind of friendly visualization, as opposed to a percentile graph, which I think was more anxiety inducing for parents to show sort of where they are exactly developmentally on a line chart. We also came up with ideas around engaging parents on social media. So we came up with an idea that they could follow their kid's birth month and receive tweets on their timelines about different milestones, and they could actually respond directly in Twitter, either through direct message or through their public timelines by using some of these hashtags. And so the idea of sort of meeting them where they were, instead of expecting them to come to our website, could we meet them where they were on social media and do it that way. And then our third idea was to use text messaging for texting milestone questionnaires to participants. So just sending the question out and they can respond yes, sometimes, or not yet. Nowadays, we might call this a chat bot. Sometimes people are doing that. It was all automated, but they could go through and as soon as they answer one question, they get the next one. And then they could text report to get a report of how they were doing. And for each of them, we'd always give them a 24-hour hotline for connecting them with local services to get evaluated. So this is our kind of a high-level overview of our design process. So we did user research, we did interviews with families and pediatricians. We also interviewed advocates who worked with specifically underrepresented populations. So we had focused on reaching Latina populations as a first go with this. We worked with Latina families through a survey to kind of get input from them as well too. We did a huge ideation brainstorming process where we sketched many ideas. We did storyboards of those ideas, and then we built some paper prototypes as well as high fidelity interactive prototypes especially for text messaging tool. And then we did evaluations through bringing people in for usability testing. And we also went to a Latina health fair to show off our ideas and get feedback that way. So kind of did a number of different methods at each stage. So yeah, so did the user research, did over 30 interviews and observations of things like child visits, where they're meeting with their pediatrician, developed over 100 different ideas. We put them all up on a private Facebook group, and we did likes and hearts and things like that to kind of vote for the ideas. We prototyped our text messaging tool via Google Voice, where we had somebody sitting on a computer next to them and the parent on their phone. And so we were typing in things and it would send it to their phone. So we were able to kind of prototype the text messaging experience before we implemented it. And then we did some surveys to assess different feedback and messaging. So here's some examples from our ideation stuff. I mentioned we had over 100 ideas. So we kind of sketched them all out, filled a room, and then put them all up and voted on them. So we had things like growth charts, things like different kiosks that they could walk up to. Like you envision something like in the and pharmacies that they could go up and complete questionnaires through the kiosk. We knew a lot of people were also doing kind of home visits. So we envisioned like a tool that home visitors could carry with them on a tablet and kind of do questionnaires as well there. We also intentionally made some bad ideas. So this is a trick within kind of stretching your thinking. And so we thought around, a parent is tagged with a location tracker to get visits from door-to-door people. Terrible idea, but we just want to get ideas out there to come up with their thinking. So intentionally putting some of those bad ideas out there, because again, we know there's lots of bad ideas, but to know what the good ideas are, you also have to compare them to some bad ideas. So we did a number of different pilot studies with the individual tools. And so each of these ranged usually around like 10 to 12 users for about 2 to 4 weeks, kind of a whole whole screening process. So we logged use, we did qualitative interviews and surveys for those pilot studies. And so some of the things we found was, for example, with Twitter, people didn't actually want to put their kids' information out on their public Twitter. They much preferred doing it on direct messaging if they wanted to do that. They also would prefer to use the website. And so they actually, they preferred the hashtag system was a little clunky to answer directly through Twitter. So they did like the reminders that they were getting through Twitter, but they would just use it. They prefer to just click on that and then go to the website and fill it out there as opposed to trying to do it through Twitter. So we ended up actually eliminating the Twitter idea because it was a clever idea, it was unique, but it didn't really meet the needs of the people that we were trying to target. With our other pilot study with the text messaging, parents sort of wanted some more information about the report. Text was naturally kind of challenging. And so we tried to think through how we can integrate some more information into the text message report. So after we did those pilot studies and we kind of threw out the Twitter idea, improved on our website design, and then really sort of iterated on our text messaging design, then we were at the point where we were to do a longer term randomized control trial. So we did a 15-month study with about 150 families with an experimental and a control group. And the experimental group had all the features of Baby Steps, and the control group just had kind of a basic web-only screener. So we tried to make it kind of close, but sort of also wanted to include some of these design features and assess whether things like using a timeline and the sort of sentimental tracking, celebratory approach, and also the text messaging, sort of this accessing them everywhere approach was helpful. And we ended up doing kind of a 2-stage process where we had the fully functional version of the website compared to the kind of controlled or plain version that's kind of mostly mimicking how they do screening now. And then about halfway through the 15 months is when we introduced the text messaging. So we're actually able to compare both the condition of having the sentimental tools and the tracking and the rich website compared to the plain website versus having text messages and not having text messages. So, our primary measure was whether parents connected with early intervention services. And then our secondary measure was thinking about things like parenting self-efficacy, engagement with the tools, and parenting sense of competency. So here's kind of what we showed in the different ones. I won't go through all of this, but the control condition had mostly just the web portal with milestone questionnaires, a progress report, and useful links. Whereas the experimental version had the questionnaires, the growth visualization using the trees that we talked about, the sentimental kind of tracking timeline and memory keeping, and then some activity ideas. And then the text messaging version, which we introduced about halfway through to the experimental group, included the milestone questionnaires and the progress reports and developmental activity ideas. So what we found is there was actually no difference in our primary outcome. So did more parents in the experimental condition end up getting connected early interventions? Mostly because the population didn't actually have that many people who needed early intervention. So it's only about 5% of people who are screened that end up needing more evaluation, and we just didn't have enough of them in either condition. So we saw no difference there. We did have some anecdotal stories of people sort of seeing something within baby steps and sort of using that to talk to their pediatrician and getting more information. And so that was good news, at least, but we didn't actually find an outcome a difference in our primary outcome. But what we did find was that text messaging was a huge win in terms of completion of screening. And so if we know that our proximal outcome is that completion of screening is something that will be helpful, we know that the text messaging was a win. So if you see this graph over here on the left, or sorry, on the right, you can see the orange line is when we introduced the text messaging tool. The orange little, this is all of our participants. The orange little hashtags are every time they completed a screen. And then orange is if they did it with the web, and blue is if they did it with text messaging. So you can kind of see there's quite a lot more with the text messaging there was online. And so some people did, only logged into the website once, didn't use it the entire time, but then completed every single screen throughout the duration of the rest of the study. So for them, text messaging was way better than having the website. And some other people, they prefer the website. They use the website more and the text messaging less. And so it really did sort of validate our understanding that different people need different ways of completing this information. But we saw some really great wins in the text messaging alone. So just some takeaways from our experience of applying human-centered design to this problem is and also in general. So for this whole experience, so I want to show you and want to emphasize that how you design your intervention is something you should consider from the very beginning. So it's not just enough to say, like, we want to develop a smartwatch-based intervention for a certain population. What's going to be on that smartwatch? How often is it going to interact with them? What kinds of information is it going to share? All those things are questions that you should be answering and should be really important to know and consider in your design, not just the fact that you have a technology versus not. And the best way to do that is to include your potential users who are going to be being impacted by and using this tool in that process as much as possible. So don't just completely build your tool and then engage them at the end. Try to engage them throughout that process. Think about things like co-design and bringing them onto your team. And finally, human-centered design, again, it's a process that's engaging your stakeholders throughout the design, and it can be a crucial part of any mHealth research agenda. So with that, that's the end of my lecture. I'm looking forward to engaging with many of you throughout the mHealth process and the Training Institute. And if you have questions, you can contact me. There's my email. You can check out my website. I'm also sort of active on Twitter, but not really, but you can follow me there if you'd like. So with that, thanks very much and enjoy the rest of the session.